In the name of the one holy and living God, amen. Please be seated. On November 25th, 1893, a 20-year-old man stepped off a ship named the Columbia and onto Ellis Island. The ship had sailed from Germany, but the young man, Franz Skrhak, was from Moravia, now a part of the Czech Republic, but then a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Conditions in the empire weren't so good for farmers. Some people were still living almost as serfs, including most of the farmers, and many young men were being conscripted into the imperial army. Life was hard. So Franz, who would later go by Frank, left his parents and his siblings behind and boarded a ship. Many other Czechs were doing the same, and many of them were going to Central Texas, of all places, where Czechs had been settling since the 1850s, and where, by the way, you can still buy kolaches at truck stops. It was a good thing that Franz was heading there because there were other Czech speakers and he spoke no English. Frank, settled in Texas, was eventually able to buy a farm, and then he was able to support the rest of his family when they came over from Moravia in 1901. I learned about Frank Skrhak from my great-grandmother, who I called Mima. As part of a class project in the 5th grade, I was supposed to learn about my heritage. Mima recorded a cassette tape for me in which she told her family's story. Mima was raised speaking Czech, so she told Frank's story alternating between Czech and English. I'd give anything to still have that tape, but it was lost somewhere along the way. At the same time, for the same school project, an aunt on my dad's side showed me a book with the Librand family tree. Librand was my last name before Charles and I got married, and I somehow ended up with a Polish last name. This family tree told me that in 1752, Johann Heinrich Librand arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, aboard the ship Elizabeth. Unlike Franz from the Czech side of the family, Johann wasn't young and single when he arrived. Johann arrived in 1752 at the age of 57 with a wife and 5 children. As you can imagine, it would take a lot to convince a nearly 60-year-old man to board a boat in the 1750s with his wife and 5 kids and sail across the world, leaving his homeland forever. He didn't do it because things were going fine. It's likely that Johann was facing economic pressure at home where farms were being taken to pay for wars, or it's possible that the religious and other conflicts of the day were taking their toll. What is now southwestern Germany had been roiled by war for generations. The colony of South Carolina at that time had a clear policy of welcoming Protestants from Europe, in large part because the English settlers were concerned that they were outnumbered by enslaved persons and Native Americans. And so thousands came to South Carolina to escape southwestern Germany. Johann declared his allegiance to the English king, changed his name to Hendrik Librand, and just like that, he and his family were given a grant of 250 acres near Lexington, South Carolina. As a result, his family survived and prospered on land that used to belong to Native Americans. And because there was a cotton gin there, it seems likely that they likely survived and prospered due to the work of enslaved persons. But they prospered all the same, and Librands spread all across the South and into Texas. These are just the stories of 2 of the men in my family tree, Franz and Johann, Frank and Hendrik, who traveled across the world for a better life as part of waves of people from their homeland escaping oppression and economic devastation. Most of the rest of my ancestors came to the U.S. in the waves of people from Scotland as economic turmoil saw people leave that place by the thousands for the Americas. Some doing quite well for themselves, most of them just getting by. Most of their names are lost to history as their journeys weren't documented. In that sense, these ancestors of mine are like so many people. So many people are always on the move. And so often they are on the move seeking safety, a better life, fleeing economic devastation, or seeking just a chance to improve their lot in life for them and their children. Sometimes migration is as simple as moving to a different state for a better job. Sometimes it is moving across the world because you can no longer farm your land. Human migration is as old as our species, and just as migration is a tale as old as time, so too is the reaction to migration. As a wave of migration increases, the reaction increases. But because of the stories that my aunt and my great-grandmother told me, when I see people crossing borders, I also see Franz and Johann. You might see someone else. We should also see in migrants the faces of our ancestors in the faith, as stories of human migration show up all over our Bible. Abram, his name later changed to Abraham, the ancestor of the Abrahamic faiths, was a migrant leaving behind his homeland in what is modern-day Iraq, traveling around the Fertile Crescent to the land of the Canaanites. Abraham at one point flees to Egypt to escape a famine, where he is fed, and he then returns to Canaan. Abraham's grandson Jacob, his name later changed to Israel, also fled with his family to Egypt to escape yet another famine. They were welcomed there and fed and kept safe. But when they multiplied, the ruler of Egypt became concerned and began to oppress the people, enslaving them. Genesis tells us that the Pharaoh told his soldiers to kill all the male children of the Israelites. But Genesis also tells us that the Israelite women were so strong and the midwives so quick at their work that many of the boys were spirited away and saved. One of those boys was Moses, who was saved by the midwives and his mother and his sister, and who escaped first into Pharaoh's household and then into Midian, where Moses received a call from God. Moses went back into the lion's den and led his people out of slavery and into a promised land. The people of God were on the move again. In today's gospel reading, like the Pharaoh who wanted to destroy the Israelites' infant sons, Herod the king wants to destroy the one the Magi have come to worship as king. Herod commences what is known as the slaughter of the innocents. The feast day for the Holy Innocents is 3 days after Christmas, sorrow following joy. But Joseph is warned in a dream to escape from this devastation. He flees to Egypt like his ancestors Abraham and Jacob, taking Mary and Jesus with him. Later, when it is safe, he returns, migrating again and ending up in Nazareth. And so Jesus is called out of Egypt like Moses, bringing liberation with him. I know that's a lot, but my point in all of this storytelling is that migration takes a central role in the stories of our lives, of our nation, and of our faith. As people of faith, then, as Christians who follow Jesus, Jesus then becomes the face of every displaced person for us, every refugee, every migrant. Abraham and Sarah, Jacob and his family, Moses and the Israelites, Joseph and Mary and Jesus, these become the faces we should see when we hear about people crossing borders. Our Anglican tradition teaches that within God's good gift of creation, humanity is made in God's image, and blessed by God's care and love. This gives all human beings a dignity that cannot be taken away. One theologian said, whenever we face another, we see a reflection of God's infinite love and glory. Whenever we face another, we see a reflection of God's infinite love and glory. This is the root of human dignity, that God created each of us, all of us, in the image of God, and that image cannot be taken away. Each of us bears the image of God, and so whatever we do to one another, we are doing to Jesus Christ himself. The Episcopal Church teaches principles of migration with dignity and asks us to observe once a year a Migration with Dignity Sunday. What does that mean? Some of that is spelled out in the inside cover of your bulletin. Human migration is on the rise again, and with the effects of climate change and economic change, it can only be expected to increase. And so too is the backlash against human migration increasing around the world. A framework of migration with dignity is not a set of policy proposals. It is not partisan politics. We have to be clear about that. It's not an argument about how many refugees a particular country should take in, though I personally do wonder whether one of the wealthiest countries in the history of the world might be able to take in just a few more. A framework of migration with dignity doesn't take away the hard work of community building and consensus building and other work that has to happen by policymakers and legislators and community members. Instead, the concept of migration with dignity should be thought of like a guide star, like a star that guides the Magi to Jesus. A guide star to teach us that migrants deserve dignity. And to teach that migrants deserve dignity is to say that when people are on the move around the world, they deserve to be safe, to be free from capricious or cruel enforcement, not to be free from laws, but to be free from capricious or cruel enforcement, to be free from violence, to be free to speak their language and exercise their religion, to be free to care for their families and improve their lives, and to return home when they are ready. Migration with dignity asks us to see migrants, people on the move, refugees, asylum seekers, as John Singer Sargent sees the Holy Family in the painting on our bulletin cover called The Flight into Egypt. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus with his little tiny halo, tired but still traveling to safety. Mary on a donkey, holding Jesus, leaning against Joseph, who holds her up. Migration with dignity is represented in this iconic 1938 poster some of you may have seen. We've had it hanging around the church before, sort of a stylized picture of the Holy Family from the Episcopal Church in 1938, in which the church declared, as refugees fled Europe, in the name of these refugees, aid all refugees. The next year, in 1939, a ship called the St. Louis left Germany with more than 900 passengers on board, most of them Jews fleeing Hitler. The St. Louis was refused permission to land in Cuba, and then the US, and then Canada, and finally had to return to Europe. There was no place else to go. More than 250 of those on board later died in the Holocaust because the leaders of these nations could not see the face of Christ in those arriving at our shores. In the name of these refugees, aid all refugees, the Episcopal Church said in 1938. The sermon is much longer than I normally give. I'm sorry for that. And could be perceived as more partisan, more political than I normally would speak. And that is not my intention. Human migration is one of the major issues of our day and will only continue to increase in importance. Millions of people are on the move. They just are on the move to save themselves and their families. And we as a church and as a nation have to get clear about our values. We will not all agree on policy specifics. We Episcopalians barely agree on anything, it should be said. We are Republicans and we are Democrats and independents and libertarians and everything in between. But our church calls us. The Holy Family calls us. Abraham and Moses call us to treat migrants with dignity and to speak up when that dignity is denied. I'll finish with the words of Malcolm Guite, who wrote a poem reflecting on today's reading, the Holy Family's flight into Egypt to escape Herod. We think of him as safe beneath the steeple or cozy in a crib beside the font. But he is with 1 million displaced people on the long road of weariness and want. Even as we sing our final carol, his family is up and on that road, fleeing the wrath of someone else's quarrel, glancing behind and shouldering their load. Whilst Herod rages still in his dark tower, Christ clings to Mary, fingers tightly curled. The lambs are slaughtered by the men of power, and death squads spread their curse across the world. But every Herod dies and comes alone to stand before the Lamb upon his throne. May we see in all we encounter the face of Jesus Christ himself. Amen.